On a limestone plateau on the west bank of the Nile, at the edge of modern Cairo, stands the last survivor of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The Great Pyramid of Giza is a stack of roughly 2.3 million blocks of stone, most of them heavier than a family car, raised some 4,500 years ago for a king named Khufu, and for nearly 4,000 years after that, nothing taller was built by human hands anywhere on Earth. Every month, millions of people type the same 4 words into a search bar. How were the pyramids built? And a lot of them are not convinced by the textbook answer. In one American survey, more than half of the respondents believed an advanced civilization like Atlantis once existed, and about 4 in 10 believed visitors from somewhere else reached the ancient past. Behind the biggest monument on Earth sits a genuine crisis of belief. So this episode takes the question seriously from both ends. What exactly do the alternative theories claim? And what does the ground at Giza actually hold? Because in 2013, on the Red Sea coast, archaeologists unsealed an ancient harbor, and inside it they found the oldest written papyrus in the world, a work log kept by a man who was there. Before we open that logbook, let's give the doubt its full day in court. In 1968, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken published Chariots of the Gods and sold millions of copies of a simple idea. Monuments like the Great Pyramid are beyond what ancient people could do, so someone else must have helped. Visitors from another world. A second family of theories keeps the builders human, but moves them out of history. A lost civilization, far older than Egypt, wiped out by some forgotten catastrophe, leaving the pyramids behind as orphans. It is worth stating their actual argument at full strength, because it is not a stupid one. The blocks are enormous, and there are millions of them. The sides face north, south, east, and west, with an error smaller than a fraction of a single degree. If the traditional 20-year figure for the build is right, a block had to be set in place every few minutes of daylight, every day, for 2 decades. And all of this, the argument runs, was done by people without iron, without the wheel in any useful form, and without machines. Too heavy, too precise, too early. That is the case, and millions of reasonable people find it persuasive. So instead of laughing at it, let's ask why it works. The honest answer is that the numbers really do break human intuition. Nobody stands at the foot of that pyramid and feels that it is an ordinary thing. The mind reaches for a bigger cause, the way it does in front of anything that seems to have no visible author. But notice what every alternative theory quietly assumes. Beneath the flying machines and the sunken continents sits one buried premise: that the people of the Bronze Age were not capable of this. That early in human history must mean simple. That premise is the actual claim. The spaceships are just its decoration. And that premise can be tested, not with opinions and not with mockery, but with what the ground itself has kept: documents, kitchens, tools, and the bones of the people who did the work. If the ancient workforce was real, it ate, slept, got injured, got paid, and wrote things down. And all of that leaves traces. The most important of those traces surfaced in 2013, in a place with no pyramid in sight. On the Red Sea coast, at a site called Wadi al-Jarf, a French and Egyptian team led by the Egyptologist Pierre Tellet opened a series of storage tunnels cut into the rock, an ancient harbor, sealed and forgotten. Inside, in 2013, they found hundreds of papyrus fragments, the oldest written papyri ever discovered, from the reign of Khufu himself. The best preserved of them is a logbook kept by a mid-level official named Merer, an inspector in charge of a crew of about 200 men. Late in Khufu's reign, Merer recorded his team's working weeks, loading white limestone at the quarries of Tura, sailing it down canals and across the Nile, and delivering it to a destination he names as Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, the name of the pyramid complex at Giza. Trip after trip, cargo after cargo, with rations and personnel accounted for. Two honest caveats said plainly. The log records the moving of the stone, not the lifting of it. By that point, the pyramid was being finished with its fine outer casing. And a few scholars read Akhet Khufu as the wider Giza area rather than the pyramid itself, although most read it as the complex. What nobody seriously disputes is what this document is. Not a boast carved for the public, but an accounting record, excavated from a sealed site by a professional mission, the least glamorous and therefore most trustworthy kind of evidence there is. A state was writing down its logistics, and a workforce that size needs more than paperwork. It needs dinner. South of the Sphinx, behind a massive stone wall the locals call the Wall of the Crow, archaeologists, led by Mark Lehner, have spent decades uncovering a town, Heit el-Ghurab, the settlement of the pyramid workforce. It is not a camp. It has streets, barracks-like galleries that could sleep around 2,000 workers on rotation, bakeries built at industrial scale, a brewery, storerooms, a copper workshop, and an administrative building. The refuse tells you how these people lived. Bread in enormous quantities, and meat, cattle, sheep, and goat, brought in from estates across Egypt at a rate scholars estimate at well over a ton of meat a day. Their skeletons show hard labor, and they also show something else. Fractures that healed cleanly, and at least one amputation the patient survived, evidence of real medical care. And then there are the cemeteries, on the slope overlooking the site. Workers buried with dignity, in tombs facing the monument they built, some with their job titles written on the walls. Overseer of the side of the pyramid, director of workers. Now set that against the most repeated story about this place, that the pyramids were built by armies of slaves. That story does not come from the ground. It traces to a Greek historian writing 2,000 years after the fact, and to a century of films. The town that archaeology actually found is a fed, housed, medically treated, organized workforce, buried with honor beside kings. Which raises its own question. Who organizes something like that? The workforce was structured like an institution, and it left its structure in writing. Crews were divided into named gangs. Names like Friends of Khufu are scrawled on blocks in spaces never meant to be seen. And the gangs subdivided into rotating teams that served their term and went home, drawn from villages across Egypt. Rations were fixed, deliveries were scheduled, and Merer's logbook shows the same crews moving between the pyramid, the quarries, and the harbors as the state redeployed them. This is the unglamorous heart of the whole story. What raised the Great Pyramid was not a secret force, it was administration. A young, centralized state that could count, feed, house, move, and motivate tens of thousands of people for decades in the service of a king they worshipped as a god. The wonder people feel at the monument is really wonder at organization, at bureaucracy 4,500 years before the word existed. So we know with unusual confidence for something this old, who was on that plateau. The harder question, the fair question, is how they did the physical work. Start with what is settled, and then be honest about what is not. The stone itself tells you where it came from. The core blocks are local. The quarries sit a few hundred meters south of the pyramid, and you can still see the cut faces. The fine white casing came from Tura across the river. exactly as Mirror's logbook describes, moving by water on canals fed from the Nile. The granite for the inner chambers came from Aswan, more than 800 kilometers upstream, by boat. Single blocks of it, heavier than 40 family cars. The tools are known because they were found: copper chisels and saws for the limestone, and handheld pounding stones of dolerite for the granite, which copper cannot cut. Slow, brutal, and effective. For moving on land, the Egyptians drew their own diagram. A tomb painting from a later era shows a colossal statue on a wooden sledge, with a man pouring water on the sand in front of it. And in 2014, a physics team confirmed the trick. Wetting the sand roughly halves the pulling force. Sledges, water, ropes, ramps of rubble and clay, and enormous coordinated manpower. Every element is attested by a find you can visit. Up to the base of the monument, the method is essentially documented. The climb is where the documents go quiet. How 2-ton blocks rose 100 meters and more is the one part of this story with no settled answer, and this episode is not going to pretend otherwise. A single straight ramp would have needed a volume of material approaching the pyramid's own, and its remains are missing. Ramps wrapping around the outside solve the volume problem, but complicate the corners and the surveying. A French architect has proposed a ramp hidden inside the structure itself. Ingenious, unproven. Ancient visitors were told of lifting devices of short timbers, and small wooden rockers that could serve that purpose have been found. The truth may be a combination, changing as the pyramid rose. Notice what kind of unknown this is. It is not evidence of impossibility. It is a gap in the paperwork. These were construction methods of their own time, held as working knowledge inside crews and their overseers. And when the state that employed those crews faded, the knowledge faded with it. Nothing needs to descend from the sky to explain a technique that died with its practitioners. Lost is a human word. Civilizations misplace skills the way families misplace recipes. Not because the cooks were fictional, but because nobody wrote the recipe down, or the writing did not survive. And the strongest proof that human hands were learning on the job is carved into the desert an hour south of Giza. The Great Pyramid did not appear from nothing. Drive south from Giza, and you pass its rough drafts, still standing in order. At Saqqara, a century earlier, the architect Imhotep stacked 6 flat tombs into a staircase. The Step Pyramid, the first monumental stone building we know of. At Meidum stands a strange tower rising out of a hill of rubble, a pyramid whose smooth outer shell now lies collapsed around its core. Exactly when it fell is argued, but its lesson was plainly absorbed. At Dashur, King Sneferu's builders started a pyramid too steep, watched it strain, and changed the angle partway up. It stands today, visibly bent, a correction frozen in mid-thought. So they built the next one shallower from the start, and it worked. The Red Pyramid, the first true, smooth-sided pyramid. Sneferu was Khufu's father. 1 generation later came Giza. That sequence is the quiet answer to the numerology, too. The alignment to true north and the elegant ratios people find in the Great Pyramid are real measurements of a real mastery, surveying by the stars, refined across a century of attempts. Trial, error, collapse, correction, success. Whoever built these needed practice. A civilization with starships does not leave a learning curve in stone. So the buildings themselves testify to builders who were learning. It is time to look at them directly. Strip away the theories, and what remains at Giza is people. And they are not anonymous. We have their job titles written in their tombs. Overseer of the side of the pyramid, inspector of the craftsman, director of the king's work. We have their menu, down to the cuts of beef. We have their beds, the sleeping platforms in the galleries, and their bakeries, with the actual bread molds still in them. We have their injuries, treated and healed, and their working lives written into their spines and knees. We have their names, chalked by rival gangs onto blocks in dark spaces no visitor would ever see. The ancient equivalent of workers signing the beam before it is sealed in. And we have where they ended, buried on the slope above their town, facing the monument, with miniature tools and jars of provisions beside them. Whatever those lives were, they were not disposable. A workforce that is fed over a ton of meat a day, patched up by physicians and buried with honor beside its kings, is something history has a plain word for. And it is not slavery, and it is not mystery. It is a profession. Which leaves one last puzzle for the theories to explain: why the pyramids stopped. If a superior intelligence had handed Egypt its construction secrets, the pyramids after Giza should have stayed superb. They did not. Khufu's successors built at Giza itself. His son's pyramid slightly smaller, the third one smaller still. And within a few generations, the royal pyramids shrank. Their cores turned to rubble and mud brick, and their casings slumped. Many of the later ones survive today as low mounds. The peak lasted roughly 1 century. Follow the money, and the mystery dissolves. A pyramid on the Giza scale was the largest single project a Bronze Age state could fund. Quarries, fleets, canals, bakeries, herds, and tens of thousands of rotating workers, all sustained for decades. That is not a trick you keep in a scroll. It is a level of state power. As the old kingdom's centralized wealth thinned out, the capability thinned with it, and the crew's hard-won techniques, the ramp geometries, the lifting drills, went wherever unused skills go. This is exactly what the phrase "methods of their time," since lost, should mean. Knowledge that lived in institutions and ended with them. The decline of the pyramids tracks the budget of the Egyptian state, not the departure schedule of anyone's spacecraft. Now put everything on one table and weigh it. On one side of the table, a sealed harbor holding the oldest papyri on Earth, in which a named official records delivering pyramid stone for Khufu. A town with streets, bakeries, and a brewery, excavated for decades, that fed and housed the workforce. Cemeteries where that workforce lies buried, with job titles on the walls. Gang names inside the monument. Quarries with their cut faces still open. Tools in the rubble. And an hour to the south, a century of visible rehearsal. Step, collapse, bend, correction, ending at Giza. On the other side, an argument from disbelief. No tool of unknown material has ever been found on the plateau. No technique appears there that lacks an Egyptian ancestor. The alternative theories require every item on the first side of the table to be a coincidence or a forgery. The papyri, the town, the burials, the learning curve, all of it simultaneously, while offering not one physical object of their own. Any fair scale tips one way. And it is worth saying that the archaeologists did not start from patriotism. They started from garbage, bread molds, and payroll, the least romantic evidence imaginable, which is precisely why it convinces. That leaves the real riddle of this story, not the engineering one, the human one. Why do so many of us prefer the other answer? Part of it is innocent. A mystery is simply more fun than a supply chain. And a good campfire story outruns a good excavation report every time. Television discovered decades ago that the question sells better than the answer, and an entire industry now depends on keeping the question open. But there is a heavier part, worth naming carefully. Every version of the alternative story, the visitors, the vanished elder race, takes the achievement away from the people who did it, and it always seems to do so when the builders are ancient, African, non-European, or otherwise assumed to be simple. It is a compliment with an insult folded inside. This is magnificent, therefore it cannot really be yours. The evidence deserves better, and so do the people in those cemeteries on the slope. None of this requires contempt for anyone who finds the theories attractive. The pyramids were engineered in part to overwhelm the human mind. That was royal policy. Standing before them and doubting that ordinary hands could do it is, in a strange way, the monument working exactly as designed. So let the record state the answer once, plainly. The ancient Egyptians built the pyramids. They built them with the methods of their own time: ramps and sledges and river barges, copper and dolerite, wet sand and star-sighted surveying. Methods held as living knowledge by professional crews, some of it lost when the world that trained those crews wound down. The loss of the technique is not the mystery. It is what happens to every technique when its institution ends. And once you accept that, the numbers from the start of this episode change their meaning without changing their values. 2.3 million blocks stop being evidence of impossibility and become evidence of organization, of a society 4,500 years ago that could hold a single intention steady across 20 years and tens of thousands of lives. That is rarer than any technology, and no one had to descend from the sky to supply it. The proof was never hiding. It was in a logbook in a sealed harbor, in the bread molds of a worker's town, and in a bent pyramid standing in the desert like a correction mark. The wonder survives the explanation. It gets larger. Because the question was never really who built the pyramids. It is why we find it so hard to believe the answer.